Good evening again, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to our Velebit podcast show. I'm very pleased again to welcome our colleague and our friend, General Glasnovic, who is also the member of the parliament, and I am pleased to discuss today a very hot topic. Welcome again, Mr. Glasnovic. How's everything?
Well, greetings to our viewers, and I think this will be a good podcast because there are interesting things here. I think that some may know, but it's not general knowledge.
Okay, well, let me start right away. Explain us a little bit about this hate speech. Tell us where it emerged, how it emerged, who was the architect of this hate speech, and don't forget also to place it in the appropriate context of Croatia. Well,
generally, it's a construct of the Marxist school, just like the anti-fascism, for example, is one scholar wrote is a dance constructed by Stalin, and we're dancing to this dance today, basically. You know, he did this to cover his crimes, and this is a construct. If you remember in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, you had paragraph 133 of the criminal code. 130.
Yeah,
I believe. Yeah. So
the penal code, right?
So therefore, you know, one wrong slip of the tongue, and you were, excuse the language, you
were in jail.
You know where you were. So you had, for example, an act. It was an act, decree that you could not criticize the great leader.
You mean Tito himself?
Tito, yeah. It was to defend the character and actions of the former locksmith, bloody locksmith. And then you had, for example, the Soviet Union, paragraph 58, which included anti-Soviet propaganda.
Okay.
For example, telling jokes. Jokes were told by the people in the Soviet Union and elsewhere. But if you told a joke, you could end up in the Gulag, one of the camps. I think one joke that I remembered that a former inmate told me. It was a joke where a son asked the father after a 15-year stint in the Gulag. He says, "Dad, was it hard in the Gulag?" And Dad said, "Oh, not that bad. Only the first 10 years."
Only the first 10 years. Good point.
Yeah.
Now, how do you see it? Is there any comparison, any analogy with the criminal code in Canada, or for that matter, the United States of America? Because we see on a daily basis there is more and more. There's more and more inquisition, if I can say, even intellectual inquisition, media inquisition in the United States and Canada. Tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, I'd call it
hate speech, or whatever that means.
Yeah, I'd call it intellectual castration.
That's a good point.
Actually, not even castration, but we're becoming eunuchs of this Frankfurt School Marxist doctrine. See, United States, you have the First Amendment, which it covers free speech. So the United States, to that extent, as long as you don't incite violence against an individual or organization or an ethnic group, you're pretty well safe. If you look at some of the websites in the United States, if the same thing was shown in Germany, you would get at least 5 years, 3 to 5 years. But then again, they tried to elitize Japan into passing this hate speech. The Japanese did not go for this. There's no such thing in the Japanese criminal code. Maybe minor fines, but remember we had the European Council movement against hate speech.
Okay.
So therefore, this has become a universal theme, which they're beating us over the head with. So what is hate speech? If I, for example, crack a joke, we're becoming humorless. This political correctness is killing us. We're living in a world where we'll soon all be watching soap operas, drinking Coca-Cola, and we'll have a muzzle here, like a dog, basically. We'll be muzzled. For example, if I crack a joke, a Sicilian told me this joke, by the way. If I say, why don't Sicilians like Jehovah's Witnesses? Sicilians don't like any witnesses. So in the near future, this will be 2 years in the joint.
Yeah, exactly.
So basically, we're becoming
a self-censored
self-censored.
Nation, right?
Yeah.
Now, again, let's focus a little bit on Canada. So please do tell our viewers to what extent the Canadian legislation, specifically as far as this Inquisition is concerned, to what extent it differs from the United States of America, which has, of course, the First Amendment, and the Americans must be happy because at least they have some remnants of some free speech. And to what extent we can draw the parallel with ex-communist Yugoslavia, with that article that you mentioned, 130.
Well, it's frightening because we're coming full circle. The West has adopted the worst ideas of the East. Cultural Marxism, we mentioned all these other social constructs and social engineering. It's frightening. Canada could be leading the way into a new, I mean, Orwell said everything, you know, he's overstated sometimes, but he foresaw all of this. What the frightening thing is that the Canadian Supreme Court decided recently that, facts are not permissible, that they're not, you cannot state facts.
Can you give us an example?
Well, if you state facts, if you, historical facts, for example, but if they might slight an ethnic group or an individual, they're not permissible in the court of law.
Even if they crack a joke. I mean,
no, the truth, the main victim here is the truth. And I think Orwell, again, I think he said that in times of universal deceit, that telling the truth will become a revolutionary act.
Yeah, this is what Orwell said, right?
Yeah, we're at this point now. What's more frightening is we have Justin Trudeau. He's the embodiment of everything that's wrong with the West. He's deconstructing the basic, undermining the basic foundations of Western society. I think even in the Canadian, the 2018 budget, which has over 300 pages, I think the word gender was mentioned, I think, 350 times, which is more than 1 time per page in the Canadian budget. We have total that gender confusion. I know teachers in Canada that are leaving their jobs because they cannot function in that environment.
In other words, they have to self-censor themselves.
Well, listen, how many genders? For example, one guy recently, he's on the internet. It's not a joke. He reinvented himself with a dog. He's sitting there with a dog mask.
Dog.
Yeah, so he can identify himself as a carrot or whatever. And it's frightening because people, let's say parents, are taking children out of school, and you have, it's called parents as first educators. They're educating children in school. See, this is permissible in Canada. Up to now, it's permissible. In Germany, it is not permissible. So we have different standards. We have no universal. There's no universal standard. As I said, you have the United States has its, but this is becoming more and more of a, you know, for the penal codes are being changed in countries to deal with this superficial verbal diarrhea
Let me just backpedal a little bit now. From our neck of the woods, let's say from the perspective of an average Croatian, from the perspective of an average, let's say, Hungarian, Romanian, there is still this idea, rather illusion, should I say, that Canada is a sort of a la-la land, that Germany is a beautiful country where people make lots of bucks when they just kick back and enjoy their beer, free speech and what have you. And yet, we know very well, and you know that best, especially as far as Canada is concerned, that there are certain things absolutely not permissible. Because you can land in jail for in a twinkle of a second.
True enough, we mentioned the truth as being one of the victims.
So basically, what you're saying is, what you're making is here is a criticism of this so-called glorious West, which is far away from the free speech, as they keep saying.
Far from. The United States is still holding on to a certain extent because of that First Amendment, and how long that will last, we don't know. But for example, let's say words. You know, the language is being massacred. For example, revisionism. Well, revisionism is taking a bad rap. So now it's one of the, if you're called a revisionist, but revision in its original, as we know, meaning is to correct.
To rectify.
To rectify.
Right?
Revision is basically the backbone of historical, of history.
Inquiry, right?
Inquiry or studies. And, but now, if you say revisionist, you're in the same bag as, say, these other, in Croatia, for example.
Yes.
Words are still like ping pong, political ping pong. You still have words between the recycled and non-recycled communists. It's all the same shit, different flies. Excuse my lingo here.
It's all right.
It basically is a clerofascist.
Yeah, well, this is fascist, a typical Orwellian lingo.
Nazi, that lingo, yeah. You know.
Yeah, well, let's focus a little bit on Eastern Europe, let's say post-communist Europe, and how does this translate, in a sense, this climate of self-censorship and political correctness that we are observing on the daily basis, specifically in Canada, to some extent, of course, to a large extent in Germany. How does this reflect in Croatia? I mean, look, there are quite a few of scholars here, there are quite a few of free thinkers, and I myself, I know it firsthand, you can still say certain things that you cannot even imagine of stuttering, of actually saying aloud in Canada or in Germany.
True enough, yes, true enough, because it's funny, as I said, we come full circle, that Canada has actually adapted the mentality and pretty soon the penal code of the former Yugoslavia. And this is, in a way, frightening. And we saw, you know, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that an immediate attack began on the nation state as an idea. So basically, we're having a construct here that's not just dangerous in the cultural field; it's dangerous in other. It's perfidious because people. The main problem with people today is that you have such an information overload that people cannot separate critical information from
facts,
from facts, or critical from non-critical, and they confuse knowledge with facts. But if you know facts, you must know how to interpret that knowledge.
Yeah, precisely.
Interpretation of knowledge, for example, to mention my grandfather, he was classically educated. He was an officer in the Austro-Hungarian army. He studied Latin. He spoke German. Well, the Hochdeutsch, the High German. I think you're probably an expert. As being an expert linguist, he also spoke Italian. But after 10 years in the penal colony of Zenica.
You mean the communist jail?
The communist jail, yes.
Specify that.
Yeah, he was there for 10 years.
In communist Yugoslavia,
yeah.
And he was in a slammer for 10 years, thanks to kangaroo courts and ex-communist. Don't be too modest.
No, and then he was released, and he had 5 years loss of citizens' rights. He could not work. So these people were forced to leave, and they were substituted by hacks that had maybe 3 years of elementary school.
I can imagine.
They were put in charge of state firms, which they totally destroyed. This is one of the reasons why Yugo fell apart, because these hacks were basically, I think the embodiment of these hacks was a fellow called Stane Dolenc, high party member.
Yeah, I remember him as well.
Yeah, we can have another joke which was circulated.
Yeah, tell us.
In the former Yugo was that you know what they were famous for was their verbal diarrhea. Yeah, the pod speak, the psychobabble. That means absolutely nothing. Yeah, you remember the central committee meetings that lasted for days, for hours. Then you'd see all these. As you call them, or we call them anal alpinists.
Yeah, rectal climbers.
Rectal climbers sleeping.
It's a good word for communists, yes. Rectal climbers. I guess I got to stress that to our audience that we called back in communist Yugoslavia, where we grew up, you know, and where we lived for some time, thanks God. We called our communist hacks, you know, rectal climbers.
Yeah, brown noses in the West.
I guess we got to teach our friends in the States. Now, just you mentioned Canada for a second. I just don't want to elaborate too much. But listen, the situation isn't much better. It is somewhat better in Australia. We're down under a couple of months back. And I know for sure, and not just in Australia, New Zealand, everywhere in Western Europe, even if you crack a mild joke, let's say, not necessarily an ugly joke against Muslim or something whatever, you can have some serious problems. So this self-censorship has become just really hilarious.
Well, back to Stane Dolenc, for example, censorship. Your father was president for 4 years for reading a newspaper.
Yeah, in communist Yugoslavia.
Yeah. Your sister was at least 9 months, and we know who lobbied for a higher sentence. It was Mr. Ante Nobile today. The big freedom fighter, the fighter for social justice.
Excellent point. And I'd like you to focus a little bit for our foreign audience, for our American friends and Canadian English-speaking audience. To what extent does the current jurisprudence, the current judiciary in Croatia, for that matter, Croatia, we can say Serbia, whatever, former communist countries, to what extent it differs, or to what extent it has similarities with the former communist judiciary? I myself, I don't see much difference. But you, as a parliamentary representative, I'm sure you know some clues.
Again, is that the famous word crypsis?
Explain it a little bit. Crypsis.
Well, it's shape shifting. Basically, I'd say these former apparatchiks, these hacks that led, as I said, for example, not just state firms, but that were in the judiciary, in all the political
education,
education, basically. Some had false academic credentials, Because that we see this today, because in Croatia and many post-communist countries, that there was sort of created a culture of cheating, cheating where you didn't succeed or advance because of your integrity and professionalism, because of connections. Just one minor detail. For example, if you wanted to make money, you paid somebody at the state firm INA 2,000, let's say, marks, to get a job pumping gas. And in a month or so, you would double that money because you would steal from the till, or you would water down, the product. So it was steal a little, work a lot. Sure. Then we go back to that.
Nobody can pay me as little
as I can do.
As I can do, exactly. Yeah. Now, you mentioned Nobilo. I mean, I'm sure now, look, we just got to make a clear distinction. So basically, the main argument is there is not much difference between the judiciary in communist Yugoslavia, which Croatia then was part of, and the present judiciary in a so-called free Croatia.
Well, no, it's the same. It's the same mental framework, same habits, same bureaucratic structure. The only thing that's changed is that they've adopted new clothes and they've reinvented themselves.
How?
Well, say as now, as I said, champions of cosmopolitanism, humanism. A perfect example
Alpine climbing.
Yeah, alpine climbing, yeah. A perfect example, which of course they do all the time, that even you have proconsuls come here from the European Union or bureaucrats, and they kowtow out of them, and that's when they do their most, when we hear speak, you think we live in the most advanced democracy ever. But a perfect example of that is the recent inquisitional hearing of Marko Jurič.
Please do explain that. I heard about this, and it's really frightening what happened. So tell our viewers a little bit more about that.
He stated general facts.
Such as?
Well, for example, that a Serbian metropolitan, one of the Serbian high priests in the Serbian Orthodox Church, which is not de facto a church but a sect because it's a national church, was singing Chetnik songs, and Chetniks basically massacred thousands.
Where was he singing that? Could you be a little bit more specific?
In the hinterland here somewhere in I'm not sure of that, but it's on the internet.
In the Croatian jurisdiction, right?
Croatian jurisdiction, yeah. And instead of fragging him for lionizing this mass murderer, who died in Arizona, as a matter of fact, at the age of 99. He fled to Arizona after the Second World War. The Chetnik movement was a royalist Yugoslav movement that they killed tens of thousands of people. Not just not to go too much into history. He was brought in for questioning. I myself...
You're talking about Marko
Jurič, yeah.
Okay, so the man of the Velebit podcast, the chief editor of the Velebit podcast, was brought to trial because he apparently said something which was not politically correct, right?
Yeah, they hauled him in. The language police and the thought police.
So, here in Croatia, in this so-called free Croatia.
Yeah, my brother, this was a decade or so ago, who spent 15 months in a prisoner war camp in the last war.
During the war?
In Banja Luka, where he was captured by Serb forces, and he was tortured for 15 months, basically. I didn't recognize him when he was released. I didn't recognize him. My mother had to pay a ransom to bail him out. 2 years after his release, there was a protesting in downtown Zagreb, and he sported a sign that said this: communism, 110 million dead, civilized Europe silent. He was jailed for carrying this.
Really, your brother, right? When he was
he spent overnight in jail for this, and
for a simple poster.
This is absolutely mind-numbing.
Tell me something a little bit. I'm sure our viewers in diaspora, or for that matter, American-speaking, English-speaking public all over the world, they would like to know a little bit about those recycled, rebranded former communists, which you call them hacks or alpine climbers, and how do they in fact now pontificate about human rights. And in fact, I'm specifically interested in Marko Jurič's case and how was he actually brought to the trial, and what was the psychoprofile of those people? Were they also former communists now pontificating about human rights?
Well, what they've done is after, as I say, after the fall of the Berlin Wall,
Right.
they infiltrated all the structures, political,
You mean the former Croatian
Croatian communist, not just the judiciary, the Ministry of Internal Affairs. You have a perfect example in Romania. You have the Securitate cadres that were never cleansed. Croatia is a country. Croatia and Slovenia are probably the only countries with these so-called lustration laws, which are supposed to deal with former cadres. Many people in the West have never heard the word lustration. 80% of Croatians don't understand the word lustration. Just to basically explain it to our viewers, lustration was introduced. It's a word that came into the language into the 1990s when you speak of new words. I believe its origin lies in Latin or
Lustratio.
Yeah, lustratio, to enlighten, to shine a light on, basically. And so you have three basic pillars of lustration. The first pillar is to let people know what happened. And this is the truth that today is being, I would say, raped and massacred globally. That's the first. The second pillar is the opening of archives.
Archives.
See, the second pillar, many of the archives are in Belgrade. So what these archives contain is their biographies, which means at one point, if you were a professor, this was a common thing.
Yeah.
For good grades, you traded sex from young students, as we know.
I didn't do that.
No, not yourself, but you know.
But I know some profs who did.
Some profs who did, of course. And other, you have people that were snitches for the.
Absolutely.
And on the basis of their snitching, people were sentenced for 1 or 2 years. Lives were destroyed. But their dossiers in Belgrade, in the Ministry of Internal Affairs in Belgrade. But that means if they're still in Croatia, in the constitutional courts, Supreme Courts, in politics, they're basically a threat to national security. See, all the archives were not torched. Former cadres that infiltrated this system today we have in Croatia at all levels, not just political but cultural, are basically
the former communists, right?
Basically have their files and use these files,
and they don't want to release them. They don't want to.
They use them selectively, probably even as blackmail.
Now let's go back to Marko Jurič's case. You know, of course, he's a prominent man, he's a prominent editor here. And what were the charges brought against him by the Supreme, by the Constitutional Court, where he was recently with the hearings? So you were there, you were present. So tell me about the.
Well, from my understanding is that wide interpretation of hate speech. What exactly is hate speech? To go back a little further in history, I was one of his last guests on his TV program.
Marko Jurič, right?
Yeah, where we showed a typical chameleon by the name of Milorad Pupovac, former party member.
Yeah, Communist Party member.
Yeah, who was educated at the party school in Kumrovac, where we still have Tito's statues there. And he basically now has reinvented himself as a fighter for Serbian rights.
Yeah,
but he's a professional Serb. But first of all, he's a communist. And in many ways, the program was called Mark's Square, Markov Trg, was banned because Mr. Jurič, he placed one question to the viewers at the conclusion of the program. That he mentioned the Croatian, the battle cry that was used in the last war is "for the homeland ready,"
right?
Which was immediately deconstructed as a fascist slogan.
Right?
So that's why he lost his livelihood. He was the program was banned, and this is just a continuation of witch hunt against Mr. Jurič. And this is the tragedy. Is this? While they're hunting down people like Mr. Jurič, we have mass murderers walking the streets of Zagreb.
Well, who was the main prosecutor in his case? And do you know something about? Well, you can mention the names.
Well, I'm not sure the name.
I
looked at briefly looked at the. It's on the internet. The New Inquisition. Yeah, to mention the names now, they've slipped my mind now, but I know basically the basic.
You mentioned that as a Saba representative, as a parliamentary representative, in several of your speeches, several of your briefs, so to say, that our constitutional court and also the Supreme Court is fully staffed with former communist, whatever, lawyers, cadres, and do you have some names? I mean, I know quite a few of them, and I'm sure our viewers can see them.
Well, we have one.
We got to have some some empirical data. And you know, the reason I'm asking you that, you remember that when I was a kid, when I was a dissident back in the States, when I was a professor, I was regularly informing and notifying. I don't want to go into some specific details about Nobilo and about all those hacks and all those communist, if you wish, henchmen, the foreign, the different agencies back in the States. And we got to do that, dear viewers. We got to do it on a regular basis. We got to tell folks, foreign embassies in Zagreb, tell something about the pedigree of Croatian current judiciary. Tell us something about those people, because unfortunately, as our guest, Željko Glasnovic, has just said, General Glasnovic, who's a parliamentary member, we have lots of those people in the judiciary, and not just in the judiciary, but in all segments of our society. Go ahead, Željko.
Well, not just the judiciary, but diplomats.
Yeah.
You have diplomats in consulates, embassies abroad. In Germany, for example, that are former UDB snitches, secret police snitches.
Do you have some names?
Well, you have the mayor of Zagreb. One of his relatives is in Tuzla. And he was a former snitch. He's in the consulate in Tuzla. Constitutional Court, for example. I saw raw material that was being analyzed, and a name popped up, was Mate Arlović, codename Verbik, and he's now a member of the Constitutional Court. You have other. Do
you have some other code names? Because recently we have received some material. And we got to tell that our audience.
Well,
we received some material from the States, from the United States, from some sources. Doesn't matter which. And you got the names. So I mean, feel free to, at least if you don't want to mention the names, just give me the code name.
I will bring the next time. Our next podcast, we will read names, but there are thousands of names on this list. To pull one or two out. Everyone was involved, from taxi drivers to politicians to Communist Party members. Just a joke again, which you probably would have gotten 2 years in the former Yugo if I told this joke. For example, was why do UDB agents make the best taxi drivers? Secret agent police. Why
taxi drivers.
Why do they make the best taxi drivers? Because they already know your name and address.
That's a good point.
Anyways, this is the.
I'm sure our viewers.
Yeah, we have to. We spoke last time that, for example, in the magnitude of this problem is why it's so hard to produce, to enact illustration laws. I mentioned just, for example, Romania, that 11,000 operatives, Securitate, secret police, were connected to 500,000 informants. So this is a huge cancer in the body politic, even Romania today, but Croatian nation. For example, the former DDR files are all open. You can see your file. East German, yeah. East German, you can see your Stasi file. And so...
But not in Croatia.
No, not in Croatia. In Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic has opened files. 300,000. Here, nothing. So basically, we're still living in political darkness. Nothing here has been. We're still trapped in the past, deeply in the past. I would say almost a Stalinist past, which today looks like some sort of a plural democracy, which it is not.
Now, you as a parliamentary representative, how are you facing off those folks? I mean, I'm pretty much sure out of those 150 MPs sitting, warming up the benches over there, quite a few of them were snitches or were part of the system. How do you actually talk to them? How do you address them?
Here's an example of one. I think he reinvented himself. His code name was Odyssey.
Ulysses.
That's Mr. Beus Richtenberg.
Oh, Beus, yes, yeah. For example, a well-known guy. Tell me something about him. Yeah, well, let's go. This is an open show. I mean, people need to know.
One of the Steve Tsule, one of the parliament members, a former soldier, he was a special police officer. He called a press conference and he read his former snitch dossier. Apparently, he was snitching students
Who was snitching? Not Tsule, but
no, not Tsule. Mr. Richtenberg.
No, let's clarify this.
Yeah, not. He had access to his file, and he read his secret police file at a press conference. And there was no reaction from the media or anywhere else. Zilch. Why? Because these are the progenies of these people that work in the press. So the system is basically insulated from outside scrutiny, because Croatia remains an insulated society. Our truth does not venture outside. I'd just like to tell our viewers that years ago, I wrote a letter to the German embassy, dealing with this problem and dealing with UDB assassinations.
UDB, explain that. UDB, you mean secret police, the communist secret police?
Yeah, right? the state security service apparatus.
All right. So you wrote to the German embassy, right?
Embassy, and trying to basically enlighten them as far as these UDB killings abroad. We mentioned once, I think, that the secret police, the security services, the Yugoslav communist police, they killed more people outside the country. Inside is total class genocide, aristicide. I won't go into that part of the history. But outside of Croatia, Yugoslav borders, more than all the Warsaw Pact countries combined. So we still have unsolved murders in Germany alone. At least 30, 40 people were killed.
In the States as well.
But these are not all, people have to understand the psychology of this. Is this Judas syndrome is totally devastated our society. Our society is still devastated by that fact. Because you had snitches at every level. One fellow mentioned to me, they infiltrated all the religious communities. And one former police officer, he said to me, he says, if some people saw their files, they would die of sorrow. They would die of sorrow because the wife was snitching on the husband on the wife. People left. I've seen files where close relatives might have been responsible for the assassination of their own close relatives. So how do you deal with this? I mean, in the end, they say conscience is the only witness you cannot bribe.
Do you think this is the main barrier for Croatia, regardless of how Croatia calls itself outside in the public as a free country, as a democratic country? But do you see that as a major barrier, as a major hurdle for Croatia's economic growth or revival, or for that matter, even for the return of Croatian?
Well, definitely, definitely, because it's all the post-communist countries. I don't like the word transition, post-transition. No, these are all, like, say, warring parties. These are all, I see that as verbal diarrhea. We're still basically mired in a one-party system. But what happened is, and this is the tragedy of former communist countries, that in that period of privatization, where we had open theft of state firms, privatization was not transparent. You had a blending of former communist cadres and a liaison of former communist cadres and criminal and semi-criminal groups. So you have clans. So you have in a way, it's not only crony capitalism, which is stuck between a layer of former communist self-interest, opportunism, and criminal goings on. So this is the problem in Croatia today, and definitely because of the lack of these lustration laws, we're still mired. We're still looking over the Berlin Wall. We're still mired in that one-party system.
We got to tell this to our American friends and also to our friends in the American government, the Trump administration, and I think I would certainly suggest, and you would suggest that to our viewers, Croatian expatriates in Australia and elsewhere in Europe, in the States, in Canada, to talk more about this and to inform the local or municipal governments, for that matter, about the UDBA pedigree of many Croatian officials nowadays. And I'm sure you must be going through a hard time now, because I know when you talk in the Sabor, in the parliament, I guess I can see 2 or 3 people there listening to you. Most of them, I'm sure, pretty much have big tails, have some murky pedigree which they don't want to talk about.
True enough, but see, those television broadcasts they're televised. Every speech is televised, so people do watch. But but the old tactics, if you're a danger to the system, what happens is the old Marxist tactic, Leninist, Stalinist, is they demonize the speaker,
They make fun of him.
Yeah,
they make fun of you. They make very often fun of you, and he talks bad. He talks this.
They don't.
Means ill.
True, they don't. They never attack what you say. They attack the character and the character assassination. So basically, it's the same tactic in a new wrapping. So, but the majority of people in these television, even the national television, are former cadres,
or their sons and daughters,
and that mental framework is transgenetically. So we have, for example, I won't talk about environmental intelligence. If you hang out with street gangs and smoke dope and crack and stuff, and if your culture is 3 R's: respect, revenue, revenge. Basically, you're a victim of that. There's much a victim of that. They're basically countercultural leftovers. They've adapted the countercultural bullshit of the West, and they've integrated it into their own socialist, communist mindset.
Well, I just wonder, and I'll ask you probably a provocative question. How come you are just about the only person who talks in the parliament, in the Croatian parliament, openly and explicitly about those names, about those former UDBA cadre, about those former Yugoslav secret police officials, and so on and so on? How come other folks, your colleagues, our colleagues, are not more vocal in airing those problems? I'm pretty much sure most of Croatian citizens, most of Croatian residents, most of Croatians, if you wish, are deeply burdened with this tragic communist legacy, which really, I myself, I don't want to talk about my case, but I'm pretty much sure. Answer this question: how come more officials, more representatives, do not come up with some solid, hardcore empirical facts and tell in the public about the former communist crimes and former communist secret police?
Well, it's an uphill battle because it's not just a political battle; it's a cultural battle. If you have the media and cultural institutions, it is much harder to carry through that first step of illustration, which is letting people know what happened, to inform people. See, we live in a world of information. People are being beaten over the head with information. And Croatia, I would say, almost gained its independence at an inopportune moment, because now we have the virtual world. We have fake news.
Yeah.
So many people can no longer distinguish fact from fiction. And in the midst of this, we have now, for example, new terminology coming in. Deep state.
Yeah. Do we have the deep state in Croatia as well?
Yeah, deep state. We have, for example, deep fakes. Deep fakes is, for example, as digital technology advances, you can replicate our speech here. Pretty soon that will be a great threat to national security. Just think.
Can you explain it? Can you give us some?
Well, for example, we had a we know Photoshop, but the next step, Photoshop, is you have deep state, deep learning, which artificial intelligence, where you can replicate.
Such as?
A character. You can take a character, replicate his speech.
You can set up him, right?
Just to give an example. For example, if you show a Western diplomat somewhere in Germany burning the Quran,
okay.
See, this can be produced artificially in the near future and put on the dark web.
Okay.
This can not only start revolutions, it can also have an impact on elections.
So
it's a powerful weapon.
About the fabrication of quote-unquote truth with a capital T, right?
Fabrication. But as I say, we're stuck in a fake news country. Croatia, the former Yugoslavia, we've lived in a fake news arena since 1945. So this is deceit is not new. Yeah. We have deceit. Deceit is as old as man itself. Black propaganda, demonizing the enemy. Germans in the First World War with babies on bayonet.
Yes, babies in Belgium.
Croatians, for example, even today.
About the stories about Jasenovac, about what have you.
True. Well, for example, we had in the Austro-Hungarian army, the former Austro-Hungarian army, in the 18th century, time of Maria Theresa, we had Croatian irregulars fighting on the side of the Austrians. Irregular troops called Pandurs.
Pandur, yeah.
Croatians are actually they're the first they almost invented light cavalry because of their experience, military experience against the Turks and so on. And they carried on campaign loaves of bread. And to scare the enemy, the Prussians and the Germans, they would say, oh, look, Croatians are eating babies. Today, they would scare their children with these. Pandori, they'll come, they'll eat you.
Yes, I'm familiar with that.
So this is, it's fake news. They're just an ancient tactic.
Željko, look, what would you suggest to our foreign viewers and listeners, and what would you also suggest to our Croatian expatriates in Australia, in the States, in Canada, and elsewhere, and for that matter to all our viewers? Are there any possibilities of exiting this vicious circle? Look, we don't want to sound too pessimistic here. We just got to make it quite clear that the situation is not good in Croatia, despite the fact that there is a certain margin of maneuvering, unlike in Germany and unlike in Canada. You can still say certain things, but by and large, our cadre, we cover that. It's full of those former communist hacks, with Mickey Mouse diplomas, we know that. But are there any ways of disentangling this situation? That
of course, every Croatian, every European, Australian, American, Canadian has to dig in his heels and start fighting against a psychotic left. That means with facts. We have to inform people as to what's happening, because we are being beaten over the head constantly with, I say, the psychotic left. Because basically communism is a mental disorder, basically. So we're looking at probably the most evil doctrine in human history today is coming to the fore in the form of sociology, twisted morality. For example, we're speaking in a world where we're speaking of sex change operations for children. We're in a world where this being created by people who have intellectualized pedophilia. For example, Allen Ginsberg, he was a member of that North American Men's Boys Love Association. He was generally a pedophile. We have Cohn-Bendit in the European Parliament
member, right?
Who glorified pedophilia. So we're seeing the total destruction of the moral fabric of the West.
Well, of course, they don't call themselves communists any longer, so let's clarify that. What do they call themselves?
Well, this is the cryptics that we see today. So, fighters for social justice.
Social justice warriors. Say GW.
Yeah, we have. So people have to understand that the new left is just like the old left. A Stalinist, Leninist anomaly that's basically destroyed not just the cultural values of the West, but is to continue to destroy lives in North Korea, to a certain extent in China. We haven't talked about, for example, censorship in China. China censors every internet, all internet information. For example, anything that's say critical of the former chairman, we know who, the most evil person in history, was responsible for the death of tens of millions. He was probably the most. He's the personification of evil, that man. But that's erased. Anything that's critical of the party is erased. So you have algorithms. You have new, for example, even Google, the Facebook. My Facebook has been banned several times. Policymakers, management that manage these companies, their policymakers. I think they've invented a new word for censorship. It's called counter speech.
I'm sure you would agree with my statement, and you can elaborate on it, that probably the advantage of living in communism was, when we were both kids before we immigrated, that we at least could decipher the hack, the communist, if you wish, or the bad man. And probably the disadvantage of our friends and colleagues in America is that you can very difficult, you can tell the difference between friend and foe. And this is what I fear most, the self-censorship and this soft totalitarianism, which is very prominent in the so-called Free West. Can you say a few words about it? We mentioned Canada at the beginning.
Well, you know the situation in Berkeley and the eroding of the Frankfurt, the critical critique, the eroding of the Frankfurt School pariahs in the United States. So basically, it's not only say the erasure of collective memory. Remember Pol Pot, the year zero?
Yeah.
It's probably the most, I think he destroyed a quarter of the population of Cambodia.
Yeah.
And he's also the personification of this, the deadly personification of this doctrine. And as yourself know, in Berkeley, you also have now, we talked about classical education, where people that were educated, they had a greater overview of the world. They read classics, they knew Latin. Now,
nothing.
Now you're getting degrees in gender studies.
I know see nothing. I know.
I remember this as a kid years ago, 60 Minutes. There was a program called 60 Minutes. Mm-hmm. And this was in the 1970s, I believe. The program, they did a general knowledge testing of American university students. Mm. They asked them who Karl Marx was. And many thought Karl Marx was one of the Marx brothers, the comedy troupe. Yeah. And this was not a joke. But I'm sure now that many, and also, for example, they thought Albert Schweitzer was a Nazi war criminal. So how can you talk to these people? When you talk to them about these things, they look at you, my brother said, they look at you. And this is the Croatian parliament, Croatian, the average, not all, hats off to individuals, but the average media person in Croatia, when you talk about this, my brother says they look at you like incomprehending gaze, like a monkey looking at a wristwatch.
At the wristwatch. I mean, unfortunately, you have that in the higher education in Croatia as well. You know, I know it.
True, at the higher levels. No.
And it's just you have to have a link if you want to get a job, if you want to land a good position. But by and large, our higher
if you want to do some alpine
climbing as well. You know, I mentioned that explicitly. You know, I just don't want to theorize, but I'd let you talk about this. Now, you can kill someone's body, but you don't kill his soul. So, in fact, at least we salvaged our souls from ex-communist Yugoslavia. True. But now look what's going on in American higher education. I know firsthand. And look what's going on in Germany, where my speeches were declined, where they boycotted and so on. So we have a very soft, creeping soft totalitarianism, which has permeated all pores of the Western society, including the U.S. society.
What the West has lost, and being Catholic, Croatia is basically a Catholic country. Catholicism here is we mentioned the monastic orders. Uh-huh. It's preserved the collective memory of a people. As I mentioned before, the Jesuits, the Benedictines, the Franciscans, especially in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Mm-hmm. You know, they had the monasteries there. They preserved the collective memory of a people that is now disappearing. While in Catholic theology, you have gifts of the Holy Spirit. One of these is the gifts of discernment. Mm-hmm. And the West has lost its gifts of discernment. And this is the big battle today, is to gain back that. I don't like to use the word critical thinking, but the West has lost the ability. Communism destroyed the ability in people to think critically. This is the greatest one. These communist regimes. Look at Venezuela today, Nicaragua, Cuba, North Korea. They not only left a legacy of ecological and human destruction in their wake, but as you said, the painful destruction of the human spirit. I think Pope Paul II said this, and I always remember this, because they waged the war not against just man and nature, but against the human spirit and against God.
What bothers me most is that I see this mimicry, you mentioned these crypsis, among the Croatian youth, and for that matter all over Eastern Europe, in Russia as well. I mean, you can say a few words about this combination of Homo Sovieticus and Homo Americanus. In other words, you have the poor mimicry with a bad accent, we can say, of Americanism, and on the other hand, you have this legacy, almost genetic legacy of this Homo Sovieticus all over in Eastern Europe, and especially here in Croatia. We can see it on the daily level, especially at some locations here in Zagreb. Can you make some comments before we wrap up our show for tonight?
Well, I think basically you saw this cultural exchange that has not been so favorable for the West. We talk about these doctrines. Many people haven't heard about Gramsci or the Fabian school.
Society. Fabian.
This is just an old ghost in new clothes. Basically, if you look back at the French Revolution, we look today at this Kinderladen. For example, we're taking children away from mothers. That's a Bolshevik.
Okay.
That's a Bolshevik tactic to be raised by the state. When we see this is nothing new. Today we see this, and is what's happening to children today. They started in German kindergartens. This movement.
Yes, you mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, they started.
They
started ideologizing children in kindergarten. In some kindergartens, they even had pictures of Mao Zedong.
But other than this iconography from the communist past,
no, they indoctrinate.
They also
them.
teach them how to change their sex, their gender.
True. Well, you have
it's not funny. This is tragic.
No. It's tragic.
And this is what really, I don't want to use a bad word, but this is really what makes me very, very concerned about the future of Croatia, for that matter, Eastern Europe, which is still, if we look ethnically, it's very homogenous, very Catholic.
Yeah.
And yet, all those, on the daily basis, all those segments of Western decadence, dissolution coming here to Zagreb, to Croatia, just scares the hell out of me.
Well, this new old cultural revolution in the West today, it was welcomed by our former cronies here, because they're already there. 3/4 mentally they were there. They simply adapted. They follow the tenets of Marxism, Leninism. You can identify them by their verbal diarrhea.
We'll definitely cover that, Mr. Glasnovic, Željko, well, in our next show, because we got to pursue those podcasts, and we can, in our next show, we'll talk a little bit about this hate speech and love speech, for that matter, and how, in fact, we are facing that in Eastern Europe. I guess it's very necessary. So again, I'd like to thank our viewers for this show, and I would like to thank Velebit podcast for the opportunity to discuss about this. Thank you very much, General Glasnovic, and I'll catch up with you next time. Thanks much.